Before we begin, a note from the observer who filed this report. I have submitted 14 field assessments in my career, hostile atmospheric surveys, TBH, plus 3 contact zone evaluations. One incident report that got me reassigned to a post so remote the supply ships arrive late on purpose. This isn't like those. This document was actually flagged by 2 separate review committees. One wanted it classified. The other wanted it retracted entirely. Not because the facts were wrong, but because, in their words, the conclusions drawn by the reporting officer raised concerns about observer neutrality. They are correct. My neutrality didn't survive this assignment. What you are about to read is my field log from Operation Threshold Watch, a routine monitoring deployment embedded with a human forward unit during the Kharkiv corridor engagement. My mission was passive observation, behavioral cataloging, combat response analysis. The kind of assignment given to junior officers who need field hours but aren't trusted with anything that matters. I wasn't supposed to care what happened to them. I want to be clear about that. I was an observer. They were subjects. The distinction was simple, professional, and for approximately 11 hours of a 43-hour engagement, perfectly intact. Then Sergeant Adeyemi picked up a piece of wreckage with a broken arm and used it to collapse a tunnel on herself. And she was annoyed about it afterward. Like she'd spilled something. I filed this report in full. I haven't softened the language. I haven't adjusted the timestamps. If the committees want to argue about my conclusions, they can take it up with the data. The data doesn't care about their concerns. Neither anymore do I. Which Observation Officer to Savrin 4, 3rd Monitoring Division Field Log. Kharkiv Corridor, Day 1 through Partial Day 3 status. Submitted under protest of reclassification. The first thing I noted in the log was the smell. I know that isn't a tactically relevant observation. I know that. But I have been trained to record environmental conditions upon insertion, and the environmental condition most immediately present when I was lowered through the relay hatch in a forward operating position Kharkiv 7 was the smell of something burning that wasn't, as far as I could determine, supposed to be burning. Later I'd identify it as the particular odor of a human eating a meal heated directly on a plasma conduit housing. At the time I logged it as unknown accelerant, possible hazard, monitoring. That was timestamp 004. By timestamp 009, I'd logged 4 separate noise violations. One instance of what appeared to be a human arguing with a piece of equipment that had no auditory processing capability whatsoever. The information that the unit I'd been assigned to observe, 7th Strike Team, Corridor Assault Division, operating designation Broken Arrow, had been in continuous engagement for the previous 19 hours before my arrival. Well, 19 hours. I'd reviewed the mission brief. I kind of understood the timeline in the abstract way that numbers are understood when they're printed on a page and haven't yet happened to anyone you know. 19 hours of sustained engagement in a contested underground transit system against an opposing force with a 3-to-1 numerical advantage and functioning countermeasure arrays. In my own unit's doctrine, the recommended maximum continuous combat duration before mandatory rotation is 6 hours. After 8, command authority passes automatically to field medics for wellness assessment. After 12, a unit's considered compromised regardless of casualty count and is pulled for psychological evaluation. The humans had been in there for 19 hours. They were arguing about food. "I'm not eating that," said the one closest to me, a compact woman with a particular kind of stillness that very tired things have when they've decided stillness is more efficient than motion. Her uniform had been repaired in at least 3 places using what appeared to be a different color of adhesive tape each time. Her left arm was wrapped from elbow to wrist in a field dressing that had been applied, by my assessment, sometime in the last 4 hours. She hadn't mentioned the arm. She was looking at a pouch of reconstituted protein with the focused displeasure of someone conducting a formal grievance. "Okafor, it's the same as yesterday's," said the tall one across from her. He had an equipment crate open beside him and was doing something to the inside of a relay detonator that the detonator's design specifications wouldn't have anticipated. Yesterday's honestly tasted like the recycler had feelings about it. All recyclers have feelings. That's the whole problem with recyclers. "Volkov, eat the ration, Okafor." She ate the ration. while making a noise that my translation matrix flagged as expressing displeasure, low intensity, possibly performative. I logged it to be fair, which I logged everything. That is the job. Observer neutrality isn't a preference, it's a function of the role. To Sovereign 4, 3rd Monitoring Division, embedded by Galactic Assessment Bureau mandate, to evaluate human combat behavior, threat response patterns, and coordination capacity under sustained engagement conditions. I had a recording array. I had 12 separate sensor feeds, which had a log that auto-timestamped every 6 seconds, and a quota of behavioral observations to meet before extraction. What I didn't have was any real sense of what I'd arrived into. The post had been described to me as a forward observation position. This is technically accurate in the way that calling a collapsing building a temporary structural transition is technically accurate. Karev, 7 to be fair, was a junction point in the transit network, a three-way intersection of old infrastructure corridors, the kind built during the original colonial expansion and never properly decommissioned. The walls were original composite, dense, load-bearing, and according to my survey data, compromised in sections by 18 months of recurring seismic activity in this sector. The 7 strike team had chosen it because it was the only defensible position between their current location and the evacuation corridor 4 kilometers north. They had been defending it since hour 6 of the engagement. I didn't understand, at first, what defending it meant in practical terms. I'd read the engagement reports. Plus, I had the map. I understood that the opposing force, the Karev Consolidation, a territorial faction whose motivations aren't relevant to this log, but whose equipment quality is rated above standard by Bureau assessment, was attempting to take and hold the corridor network. I sort of understood the tactical picture. What NT modeled was that defending a three-way junction with a 7-person unit against a force of at minimum 30 meant that the unit was, by any rational analysis, not actually defending anything. They were occupying a position that was going to be taken from them. The only question was how long they could delay it. And to what purpose? Actually, I asked. This look was perhaps a deviation from strict observer protocol, but I needed to understand the operational context to categorize what I was seeing. I asked the tall human, Volkov, who was now reassembling the detonator with a focused efficiency, of someone who had done this enough times that his hands worked independently of his attention. Why are you still here? I said, by my calculation, extraction via northern corridor is possible for approximately 11 more hours, he said, without looking up. Yeah. The force disposition suggests that we're going to get hit again in about 40 minutes, that Okafor's arm isn't as fine as she says it's, and that Nkosi has been running the eastern sensor array on manual since the automated relay burned out 6 hours ago, which means he has since slept. He slid the detonator housing closed, tested the connection. What's your I guess question? Why remain? The probability of successful defense is not why we're here. He looked up then. He had the kind of face that had been outdoors in bad conditions for a long time, creased in specific ways, weathered in others, with the particular blankness around the eyes that I'd come to associate with humans who had decided their emotional processing could wait. We're basically here because the evac transport can't reach the northern terminus for 11 more hours, and there are 26 civilians in the access level above us who need that transport. He went back to his equipment. I logged unit motivation, protection of non-combatant population, 11-hour defensive requirement against superior force. Assessed pretty much, probability of unit survival to extraction, 31%. Units aware of this, and continuing anyway. I looked at that entry for a moment. I added, note for review. Units with survival probability below 40% typically initiate surrender or withdrawal protocol. This unit's not done so. Classifying as behavioral anomaly, monitoring. The attack came at timestamp 117. Not 40 minutes, pretty much which 23. I logged the discrepancy automatically and then stopped caring about the discrepancy because the eastern corridor wall developed a crack that went from floor to ceiling in approximately 1 second. And the crack was followed by concussive pressure that my suit dampeners reduced to merely painful, and the unit was moving before I'd fully processed that the attack had begun. This is one of the things that doesn't translate well into a monitoring report. I have filed combat observation logs before. I know how to describe tactical response. I can categorize movement patterns, identify formation types, assess fire discipline. These are skills. I have them. What I wasn't prepared for was the speed. Not speed in the sense of movement velocity. I have sensors for that. Speed in the sense of compression. The time between the wall cracking and 7 humans occupying 7 different positions covering all 3 corridor approaches was short enough that my timestamp system logged the entire transition as a single event. They had been eating, produce, aga, sleeping, running a manual sensor relay, plus, and then the wall cracked and they were already where they needed to be doing what needed doing with a coordination that had no visible signal I could identify. No verbal command. Nothing TBH on the comm channel I was monitoring. One of them pretty much, the small one NT learned the name of Yet, young with a scar bisecting one eyebrow, was at his position before I could see him move. He had been asleep. I confirmed this at timestamp 109. He had been asleep, and then he wasn't, and he was in position with his equipment ready and his eyes clear. Okafor's arm, the one with the dressing, was the arm she braced her weapon with. For what it's worth, I noted this. I noted it, and I didn't comment on it, and I filed it under behavioral observation and moved to a position behind a structural column where my sensors could cover the eastern approach without putting me in primary fire lines. The engagement lasted 19 minutes, which I have the full sensor record. I could describe in sequence. The 2 attempts on the eastern corridor, the flanking attempt via the maintenance crawl space that Volkov apparently anticipated because he had placed a collapsed equipment rack across the entry point sometime before my arrival. The moment when Okafor moved from her position to cover the central corridor when a soldier named Ferraro took a hit to the leg and couldn't hold his angle. But what I keep returning to in the log is timestamp 124. 7 minutes into the engagement. The kind of eastern corridor attempt had been repelled. The flanking attempt had been stopped. There was a pause. I assessed it as a tactical reorganization pause, opposing force reassessing approach vectors. In that pause, which lasted 41 seconds, Okafor checked Ferraro's leg with her unbandaged hand because the bandaged one was still holding her weapon. She checked it, said something to him I didn't catch, and he nodded. Her voice had a quality my translation matrix described as calm, matter-of-fact, reassuring. She was reassuring him, in my opinion, during the pause. Well, between attempts. Ferraro's response was a short sound my matrix flagged as acknowledgement, wry effect, pain masked. He adjusted his angle. He was still in position when the next attempt came 3 minutes later. After the engagement ended, the opposing force withdrew. I assessed for resupply and reinforcement, not retreat. They'd be back. The unit ran what I describe as a maintenance cycle. Checking equipment, rotating the manual sensor watch, attending to wounds. Volkov's left shoulder had a burn through the suit material that I estimated, extended into the first layer of tissue beneath. He looked at pretty much at the way I look at a defective sensor, with mild professional irritation. Tessavrin, he said. Yes. You took position behind the column. It was the tactically sound observation point. Uh-huh. He was applying something to the burn. He pretty much didn't appear to find the process of applying something to a tissue burn while conducting a conversation to be a notable coordination challenge. You do field work before this? This is my 4th embedded assignment. Combat embedded. This is my first. He made a sound, not a word. A sound that contained a quantity of information my translation matrix declined to fully categorize. Filed it as understanding, unsurprised, reserved. He handed something to Okafor without looking at her. She caught it without looking at him. I watched that. The handoff. No signal. No look. The object, a small tool of some kind, passed between them like it had been pre-agreed. I honestly thought about the 19 hours before I arrived. You spend 19 hours being attacked in an underground corridor, and something happens to the gaps between people. The visible communication compresses down until it's almost nothing, because you've already had every conversation. You already know what the other person is going to need before they know they need it. This isn't a finding I expected to be writing in a behavioral monitoring report. You know, I wrote it anyway. Plus, at timestamp 341, I completed my first full observation cycle, and submitted a preliminary summary to Bureau Relay. The summary was, by necessity, accurate, which I described the unit's tactical competency. For what it's worth, their response coordination, their casualty management. I didn't describe Okafor eating the ration and making a face. I didn't describe the handoff. I didn't describe the 41 seconds of reassurance between attempts. These didn't belong in a tactical assessment. They didn't fit in any of my categories. The relay station would be doing a full log review in 6 hours. I'd 9 more hours before the transport window. I told myself that was fine. That was plenty of time to maintain professional distance. The next attack came at timestamp 4:02. The attack actually, at timestamp 4:02, wasn't the worst one. I want to be precise about this because my field log for that period is detailed and somewhat chaotic in its structure, and a review committee might read the erratic timestamp intervals and conclude that the engagement was the most severe of the night. It wasn't for what it's worth. It was severe. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and the reason my log structure became erratic around hour 5 has less to do with the engagement and more to do with the conversation that happened during it. This is the part I had difficulty categorizing. The attack itself followed the same general pattern as the first. Pressure on the eastern corridor, probe at the central junction, attempt to identify which approach the unit had weighted. What was different was that this time they had a ranged disruptor unit, which they positioned somewhere in the eastern approach and which at timestamp 4:09 detonated one of the overhead structural supports. The support came down in the corridor between the eastern sensor array and the central junction. Not on anyone, but it sent a section of the ceiling through the floor of the access level above us. I was monitoring the access level feed. I had 26 civilian readings in that access level. After the ceiling came down, I had 24. The remaining 2 were in a section of the access level that was now open to the contested corridor below. Volkov was already moving toward the maintenance ladder before I'd processed what the sensor readings meant. I didn't see him communicate this decision. I didn't see him tell anyone. The unit adjusted. Okafor sliding left to cover his former angle, the young one with the scarred eyebrow moving to fill the gap, and Volkov went up the ladder while the disruptor was still cycling for a second shot. The disruptor fired at timestamp 4:11. Plus, basically, it hit the wall 6 centimeters from where Volkov had been 2 seconds earlier. He was at the top of the ladder. He was pulling 2 civilians. I could see from the sensor data a small adult and what registered as a juvenile, a child, back from the edge of the floor collapse. He was doing actually this while the corridor below was still active. He got them to the far side of the access level and came back down the ladder with a piece of structural composite wedged under one arm that he subsequently used to shore up the damaged sensor array mounting. I logged this under non-combatant extraction during active engagement, success. Additional utility behavior, salvage/repair under fire. Then, to be fair, I sat with that log entry for a moment. The accessing of sort of salvageable material while in an active combat zone, and the immediate repurposing of that material for a different tactical need during the 60 seconds between a disruptor shot and a potential follow-up shot, while also having just extracted 2 civilians from structural collapse. This is a thing that happened. I watched it happen. My sensors have it from 4 angles. I don't have a category for it. Plus, the closest category in my monitoring framework is multitask execution under stress. But that category exists to describe, for example, a unit maintaining formation while taking a casualty. Not what I watched. The categories assume a kind of linear processing. One task completes, another begins. What Volkov did didn't look like that. It looked like all of it was the same task. The civilians and the sensor mount and the ladder and the disruptor and the timing and the gap he'd left in the formation that his unit had already filled without being asked, all one task. I was still looking at my logs when I became aware that Okafor had positioned herself approximately 2 meters to my left and was looking at me. "You pretty much doing okay?" she said. "I'm observing," I said. "That is my function." "Sure." She had her weapon at a low carry, not holstered, but not aimed at anything. The bandaged arm was the lower one. Plus, I could see at the edge of the dressing that the pressure had caused some weeping of the wound beneath. She hadn't looked at it. You've sort of been standing in the same spot for about 4 minutes. During an active engagement, I was documenting. Your sensor array does that automatically. This was accurate. Didn't think to add to it. My designation is Tess Savarin, I said finally. 4th iteration. My division keeps the same name structure across iterations, which my colleagues find confusing and I find practical. Okafor, she said. 1st iteration. To be fair, Mother thought numbers were pessimistic. That is, I processed this. That is, in my opinion, view idn't encountered. She had a lot of views. There was something in her voice when she said this that my translation matrix didn't have a clean category for. It flagged it to be fair as effective reference, past tense relationship, mixed valence. You're monitoring kind of us for the Bureau? Behavioral assessment and combat response documentation, yes. So you're watching everything. Everything I can sense or cover, yes. She nodded slowly. The engagement sounds in the eastern corridor had changed character. The disruptor hadn't fired again, which I assessed as a potential repositioning scenario. Okafor was watching the junction without appearing to watch it, in the way that very trained things watch everything peripherally while appearing to focus on one point. What's the weirdest thing you've logged so far? She said. INT expected this question. I ran through my log entries. There were several candidates, which Volkov argued with the detonator housing for approximately 90 seconds before reassembling it. I said. He called it a name, which the detonator didn't respond. He seemed unsurprised by this, but continued the conversation anyway. Okafor's face did something my translation matrix classified as amusement, genuine, moderate intensity. He names all his equipment. The equipment cannot hear him. He knows that. He's named the last 3 sets of equipment he's gone through. Gives them funerals too, when they go out of service. He performs memorial rites for tools. Full ceremony. Recommits them to the void, which last tour, we held a service for a field knife that saved his life 3 separate times. 20 minutes. Plus, he wrote something for the occasion. I looked at my log. I looked at the entry for Volkov's shoulder burn. I looked at the entry for the multitask extraction. He grieved for objects, I said. He loves them. She said it simply, and like it was self-evident. Things that work for you. You love them. That's just how it's. I made a note in my log. I didn't know how to categorize it, so I filed it under miscellaneous behavioral observation and put a flag on it for review. The disruptor fired from a new position at timestamp 429. The unit had already rotated toward it. Here is what I didn't include in my preliminary report at timestamp 06:00. I didn't include the fact that at some point in the period between the 2nd and 3rd engagements, I cannot give an exact timestamp because I wasn't technically in full monitoring mode during this period, which is a deviation I'm documenting here, and accept professional responsibility for Nkosi, the soldier running the manual sensor array, taught me 3 words in a language my matrix had no record of. He said they were from a regional language spoken by approximately 4 million people on a single continent of humanity's home planet. He said his grandmother had spoken it to him when he was young, and he thought in it sometimes when he was tired, which he currently was. The words were Ubuntu, a concept he described as, I'm because we're. He TBH said there was no single sentence translation that fully carried it. He said it was less a word and more a way of measuring existence, that personhood wasn't individual but relational, that you became real through your connection to others, and they became real through their connection to you. Sabobona. Literally, I see you, but not TBH in the sense of visual perception, in the sense of acknowledgement, of recognition, which of saying, you are present and you matter, and I'm marking that. He said his grandmother said it every morning. He said most, I guess, languages had a greeting that technically meant it, but that this one meant it. The 3rd word he wouldn't translate. He said some things traveled better in their original form. He said if I ever met another human from that region, I could ask them. I have the word in my log, and I look at it sometimes. I was still thinking about Ubuntu when the 3rd engagement began at timestamp 714, and it was the worst one, and this is where the log gets complicated. The Karev consolidation had spent the previous hour, and a half deploying. I didn't know this at the time. My sensor coverage of the outer corridor network was limited to what the unit's equipment could reach. The unit's equipment, to be fair, was at this point operating at approximately 60% of baseline capacity due to accumulated damage and the power drain from maintaining the access level sensor feed. What I knew was that 3 approaches lit up simultaneously at 7:14, and the sound the Eastern Corridor made when the first unit breached wasn't one my audio processing recognized as a standard breach entry. They had a RAM, which is structural collapse device, designed for exactly these situations: defended junctions, limited maneuver space, fortified positions. You bring the ceiling down on the defenders, and then you walk through. Volkov said one word when he identified it. I won't include the word. Plus, look, it was in a language my matrix did list, and the translation was accurate, and it conveyed the situation clearly enough. The unit moved to secondary positions, deeper in the junction, away from the Eastern Corridor, which was now the primary collapse risk. Ferraro, with the leg wound, was slower, and Kosi took his weight. They moved as a unit. I moved with them because the alternative was to stay near the Eastern Corridor, and I'd assessed that option and found it poor. At timestamp 7:19, the ram fired. The Eastern Corridor ceiling came down, and not fully. The composite was old and dense and didn't collapse cleanly. What happened instead, was that approximately 4 meters of corridor became inaccessible under debris, and approximately 1 meter of ceiling above the junction itself developed a fracture pattern that my sensor assessment flagged as secondary collapse risk, high probability, time frame unknown. The unit had seconds to reassess, and what they did in those seconds, Volkov identified that the collapse had blocked the RAM unit's advance, but had also buried the eastern sensor array, which meant the unit was now blind on that approach. Okafor, identified that the fracture pattern above the junction made holding the junction untenable. The young one with the scarred eyebrow, his name was Huang, I'd logged it by this point, identified that the maintenance crawl space Volkov had blocked earlier in the night had a secondary branch that, if clear, led to a position flanking the consolidation's current deployment. They communicated all 3 of these assessments to each other in the time it took me to process the first one. Then Okafor said, "How long?" Huang said, "For minutes to get there. Maybe more." Okafor looked at the ceiling. "At the fracture, which we don't have 4 minutes." "No," Volkov said. There was a pause. It wasn't a long pause, and "Someone holds the junction," Volkov said. "Someone honestly holds the junction," Okafor said. It wasn't an agreement or a disagreement. It was a statement of the thing they were all looking at. "I'll hold the junction," Volkov said. "No," said Okafor. "It makes sense. My shoulder's already. I'll hold it." She said it the way she'd eaten the ration. Like it was a logistical decision. Plus, like it was the obvious thing, and she was just confirming the obvious. I want to be careful here about what I'm describing. A person volunteering for a dangerous task isn't unusual in combat contexts. I have logged similar decisions in prior assessments. The anomaly isn't the volunteering. The anomaly is that she was going to hold a junction under an unstable ceiling against an advancing force for 4 minutes with a functional arm, a compromised arm, and no support, and the reason she used to justify taking this task instead of Volkov was, "I'm faster. I can move when it starts to come down." She said when, not if, and she knew the ceiling was going to come down. She held the junction anyway for 3 minutes and 50 seconds, which I know because I didn't leave. I want to be precise about this in my log. I wasn't required to stay. Observer protocol permits extraction during high-risk phases. I didn't extract. I stayed at a position near the secondary corridor entrance, and I kept my sensor array running, and I watched Okafor hold a junction under a cracked ceiling. She fired at angles didn't have attempted. She moved between positions with the particular economy of someone who has done the math on exactly how much energy each action costs, and is spending accordingly. At timestamp 7:31 a.m. section of ceiling. Not the main fracture, a secondary piece, fell 6 meters to her left, and she didn't flinch. At timestamp 7:33, in my opinion, Huang's voice came through the comm with a single word, "Ready," and Okafor moved. She moved before the main fracture went, and I have analyzed the sensor record. The gap between her clearing the junction and the ceiling collapsing was 1.2 seconds. She had made that assessment in her head, and she was right by 1.2 seconds. The ceiling came down on the advancing consolidation unit. The flanking action from Huang's position caught the rest of them while they were processing what had just happened. The engagement ended at 7:41. I found Okafor in the secondary corridor at timestamp 7:42. She was sitting against the wall, eating another ration and making the same face she'd made about the first one. Her bandaged arm was bleeding through the dressing again. I started terrible rations, she said. Every single one. Plus, you think they could do better. I looked at her, at the dressing, at the ration, at the junction behind us, which was now several tons of composite and the remains of an armored advance, and which had bought 26 civilians in the access level above us another 2 hours and 12 minutes closer to the transport window. I had a log entry open. I didn't write anything in it for a long time. I sat down against the wall across from her. I'm documenting this deviation from observer protocol as well. She offered me part of the ration. I declined. She shrugged pretty much and ate the rest of it and made one more face about the flavor, and it was a completely ordinary face about a completely ordinary thing, and I watched her make it, and I thought about Ubuntu, and I thought about Volkov's funeral for equipment, and I thought about Nkosi's third word that he wouldn't translate. I looked at the log. At timestamp 7:48, I added a field I'd never used before in a monitoring report. It wasn't a standard bureau category. I created it myself, which I labeled it, things I don't have words for. Then, I wrote her name in it. Just her name, which is cool.